True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been, and am, but why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken, and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered into my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none. Passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture. A pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so, by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now, this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently, and then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed so that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head, and oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place the whole of my head within the opening so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work. For it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he had passed the night. So, you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. Oh, watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph to think that there I was opening the door little by little, and he had not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now, you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch with the thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened through fear of robbers, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed, listening, just as I have done night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh, no. It was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has wailed up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and pitied him. Although I chuckled at heart, I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise, when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him, and he had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor, or it is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him, and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of a spider, shot out from the crevice, and fell full upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray as if by instinct precisely upon the damned spot. And have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the senses? Now, I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker, and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still, but the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst. Now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done, but for many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead, stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. Now, if you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatsoever. I'd been too weary for that. Tub had caught it all. When I had made an end of these labours, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbour during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I now to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure and undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears, but still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt now I grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. Oh, I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh, God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore, I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose all over and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think, but anything was better than this agony, anything more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die, and now, again, hark, louder, 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 villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Hear, hear, it is the beating of his hideous heart.
Thunder in the black skies beating down the rain, thunder in the black cliffs looming o'er the main, thunder on the black sea and thunder in my brain. God's on the night wind, Satan's on his throne, by the red lake lurid and great grim stone, still through the roofs of hell the brooding thunders drone. Trident for a rapier, Satan thrusts and foins, crouching on his throne with his great goat loins, cells are his footstools and hearts are his coins. Slave of all the ages, though lord of the air, Solomon o'ercame him, set him roaring there, crouching on the coals where the great flames flare. Thunder from the grim gulfs out of cosmic deep, where the red eyes glimmer and the black wings sweep. Thunder down to Satan, wake him from his sleep. Thunder on the shores of hell, scattering the coal, riding down the mountain on the moon mare's foal, blasting out the caves of the gnome and the troll. Satan, brother Satan, rise and break your chain. Solomon is dust and his spells grow vain. Rise through the world in the thunder and the rain. Rush upon the cities, roaring in your might. Break down the towers in the moon's pale light. Build a wall of corpses for God's great sight. Quench the red thunder in my brain this night. Landlord, ho! The shout broke the lowering silence and reverberated through the black forest with sinister echoing. This place hath a foreboding aspect, meseemeth. Two men stood in front of the forest tavern. The building was low, long, and rambling, built of heavy logs. Its small windows were heavily barred, and the door was closed. Above the door its sinister sign showed faintly a cleft skull. This door swung slowly open, and a bearded face peered out. The owner of the face stepped back and motioned his guests to enter, with a grudging gesture, it seemed. A candle gleamed on the table, a flame smouldered in the fireplace. "Your names?" "Solomon Kane," said the taller man briefly. "Gaston Learmont," the other spoke curtly. "But what is that to you?" "Strangers are few in the Black Forest," grunted the host. "Bandits many. Sit at yonder table and I will bring food." The two men sat down with the bearing of men who have traveled far. One was a tall, gaunt man, clad in a featherless hat and somber black garments, which set off the dark pallor of his foreboding face. The other was of a different type entirely, bedecked with lace and plumes, although his finery was somewhat stained from travel. He was handsome in a bold way, and his restless eyes shifted from side to side, never still an instant. The host brought wine and food to the rough-hewn table, then stood back in the shadows like a somber image. His features, now receding into vagueness, now luridly etched in the firelight as it leaped and flickered, were masked in a beard which seemed almost animal-like in thickness. A great nose curved above this beard, and two small red eyes stared unblinkingly at his guests. "Who are you?" suddenly asked the younger man. "I am the host of the Cleft Skull Tavern," sullenly replied the other. His tone seemed to challenge his questioner to ask further. "Do you have many guests?" Learmont pursued. "Few come twice," the host grunted. Kane started and glanced up straight into those small red eyes, as if he sought for some hidden meaning in the host's words. The flaming eyes seemed to dilate, then drooped sullenly before the Englishman's cold stare. "I'm for bed," said Kane abruptly, bringing his meal to a close. "I must take up my journey by daylight." "And I," added the Frenchman. "Host, show us to our chambers." Black shadows wavered on the walls as the two followed their silent host down a long, dark hall. The stocky, broad body of their guide seemed to grow and expand in the light of the small candle which he carried, throwing a long, grim shadow behind him. At a certain door he halted, indicating that they were to sleep there. They entered. The host lit a candle with the one he carried, then lurched back the way he had come. In the chamber the two men glanced at each other. The only furnishings of the room were a couple of bunks, a chair or two, and a heavy table. "Let us see if there be any way to make fast the door," said Kane. "I do not like the looks of mine host." "There are racks on the door and a jab for a bar," said Gaston, "but no bar." "We might break up the table and use its pieces for a bar," mused Kane. "Mon Dieu," said Learmont. "You are tremendous, monsieur." Kane scowled. "I like not being murdered in my sleep," he answered gruffly. "My faith," the Frenchman laughed, "we are chance met. Until I overtook you on the forest road an hour before sunset, we had never seen each other." "I have seen you somewhere before," answered Kane, "though I cannot now recall where. As for the other, I assume every man is an honest fellow until he shows me he is a rogue. Moreover, I am a light sleeper and slumber with a pistol at hand." The Frenchman laughed again. "I was wondering how monsieur could bring himself to sleep in a room with a stranger." "All right, Monsieur Englishman. Let us go forth and take a bath from one of the other rooms." Taking the candle with them, they went into the corridor. Utter silence reigned, and the small candle twinkled redly and evilly in the thick darkness. "Mine host hath neither guests nor servants," muttered Solomon Kane. "A strange tavern. What is the name now? These German words come not easily to me. The Cleft Skull? A bloody name, my faith." They tried the rooms next to theirs, but no bar rewarded their search. At last they came to the last room at the end of the corridor. They entered. It was furnished like the rest, except that the door was provided with a small barred opening, and fastened from the outside with a heavy bolt, which was secured at one end to the door jamb. They raised the bolt and looked in. "There should be an outer window, but there is not," muttered Kane. "Look!" The floor was stained darkly. The walls and the one bunk were hacked in places, great splinters having been torn away. "Men have died in here," said Kane somberly. "Is yonder not a bar fixed in the wall?" "Aye, but 'tis made fast," said the Frenchman, tugging at it. A section of the wall swung back, and Gaston gave a quick exclamation. A small, secret room was revealed, and the two men bent over the grisly thing that lay upon its floor. "The skeleton of a man," said Gaston, "and behold how his bony leg is shackled to the floor. He was imprisoned here and died." "Nay," said Kane, "the skull is cleft. Methinks mine host had a grim reason for the name of his hellish tavern. This man, like us, was no doubt a wanderer who fell into the fiend's hands." "Likely," said Gaston without interest. He was engaged in idly working the great iron ring from the skeleton's leg bones. Failing this, he drew his sword, and with an exhibition of remarkable strength, cut the chain which joined the ring on the leg to a ring set deep in the log floor. "Why should he shackle a skeleton to the floor?" mused the Frenchman. "Mon Dieu, 'tis a waste of good chain. Now, monsieur," he ironically addressed the white heap of bones, "I have freed you, and you may go where you like." "Have done." Kane's voice was deep. "No good will come of mocking the dead." "The dead should defend themselves," laughed Clermont. "Somehow I will slay the man who kills me, though my corpse climb up 40 fathoms of ocean to do it." Kane turned toward the outer door, closing the door of the secret room behind him. He liked not this talk which smacked of demonry and witchcraft, and he was in haste to face the host with the charge of his guilt. As he turned with his back to the Frenchman, he felt the touch of cold steel against his neck, and knew that a pistol muzzle was pressed close beneath the base of his brain. "Move not, monsieur." The voice was low and silky. "Move not, or I will scatter your few brains over the room." The Puritan, raging inwardly, stood with his hands in the air, while Learmont slipped his pistols and sword from their sheaths. "Now you can turn," said Gaston, stepping back. Kane bent a grim eye on the dapper fellow, who stood bareheaded now, hat in one hand, the other hand leveling his long pistol. "Gaston the butcher," said the Englishman somberly. "Fool that I was to trust a Frenchman. You range far, murderer. I remember you now with that cursed great hat off. I saw you in Calais some years agone." Aye, and now you will see me never again. What was that? Rats exploring yon skeleton, said Kane, watching the bandit like a hawk, waiting for a single slight wavering of that black gun muzzle. The sound was the rattle of bones. Like enough, returned the other. Now, Monsieur Kane, I know that you carry considerable money on your person. I had thought to wait until you slept and then slay you, but the opportunity presented itself, and I took it. You take easily. I had little thought that I should fear a man with whom I had broken bread, said Kane, a deep timbre of slow fury sounding in his voice. The bandit laughed cynically. His eyes narrowed as he began to back slowly towards the outer door. Kane's sinews tensed involuntarily. He gathered himself like a giant wolf about to launch himself in a death leap. But Gaston's hand was like a rock, and the pistol never trembled. "We will have no death plunges after the shot," said Gaston. "Stand still, monsieur. I have seen men killed by dying men, and I wish to have distance enough between us to preclude that possibility. My faith, I will shoot, you will roar and charge, but you will die before you reach me with your bare hands, and mine host will have another skeleton in his secret niche. That is, if I do not kill him myself. The fool knows me not, nor I him, moreover." The Frenchman was in the doorway now, sighting along the barrel. The candle, which had been stuck in a niche in the wall, shed a weird and flickering light which did not extend past the doorway, and with the suddenness of death, from the darkness behind Gaston's back, a broad, vague form rose up, and a gleaming blade swept down. The Frenchman went to his knees like a butchered ox, his brains spilling from his cleft skull. Above him towered the figure of the host, a wild and terrible spectacle, still holding the hanger with which he had slain the bandit. "Ho, ho!" he roared. "Back!" Kane had leaped forward as Gaston fell, but the host thrust into his very face a long pistol which he held in his left hand. "Back!" he repeated in a tigerish roar, and Kane retreated from the menacing weapon and the insanity in the red eyes. The Englishman stood silent, his flesh crawling as he sensed a deeper and more hideous threat than the Frenchman had offered. There was something inhuman about this man, who now swayed to and fro like some great forest beast, while his mirthless laughter boomed out again. "Gaston the butcher!" he shouted, kicking the corpse at his feet. "Ho, ho, mine fine brigand will hunt no more. I had heard of this fool who roamed the Black Forest. He wished gold, and he found death. Now your gold shall be mine, and more than gold, vengeance." "I am no foe of yours," Kane spoke calmly. "All men are my foes. Look, the marks on my wrists. See, the marks on my ankles. And deep in my back, the kiss of the knot. And deep in my brain, the wounds of the years of the cold, silent cells where I lay as punishment for a crime I never committed." The voice broke in a hideous, grotesque sob. Kane made no answer. This man was not the first he had seen whose brain had been shattered amid the horrors of the terrible continental prisons. "But I escaped!" The scream rose triumphantly. "And here I make war on all men." What was that? Did Kane see a flash of fear in those hideous eyes? "My sorcerer is rattling his bones," whispered the host, then laughed wildly. "Dying, he swore his very bones would weave a net of death for me. I shackled his corpse to the floor, and now, deep in the night, I hear his bare skeleton clash and rattle as he seeks to be free. And I laugh, ho ho, how he yearns to rise and stalk me like old King Death along these dark corridors when I sleep, to slay me in mine bed." Suddenly the insane eyes flared hideously. "You were in that secret room. You and this dead fool. Did he talk to you?" Kane shuddered in spite of himself. Was it insanity, or did he actually hear the faint rattle of bones, as if the skeleton had moved slightly? Kane shrugged his shoulders. Rats will tug even at dusty bones. The host was laughing again. He sidled around Kane, keeping the Englishman always covered, and with his free hand opened the door. All was darkness within, so that Kane could not even see the glimmer of the bones on the floor. "All men are my foes," mumbled the host in the incoherent manner of the insane. "Why should I spare any man who lifted a hand to my aid when I lay for years in the vile dungeons of Karlsruhe, and for a deed never proven? Something happened to my brains then. I became as a wolf, a brother to these in the Black Forest to which I fled when I escaped. They have feasted, my brothers, on all who lay in my tavern, all except this one who now clashes his bones, this magician from Russia, lest he come stalking back through the black shadows when night is over the world, and slay me. For who may slay the dead? I stripped his bones and shackled him. His sorcery was not powerful enough to save him from me, but all men know that a dead magician is more evil than a living one. Move not, Englishman. Your bones I shall leave in this secret room, besides this one too." The maniac was standing partly in the doorway of the secret room now, his weapon still menacing Kane. Suddenly he seemed to topple backwards and vanished in the darkness, and at the same instant a vagrant gust of wind swept down from the outer corridor and slammed the door shut behind him. The candle on the wall flickered and went out. Kane's groping hands, sweeping over the floor, found a pistol, and he straightened, facing the door where the maniac had vanished. He stood in the utter darkness, his blood freezing while a hideous muffled screaming came from the secret room, intermingled with the dry, grisly rattle of fleshless bones. Then silence fell. Kane found flint and steel and lighted a candle. Then, holding it in one hand and the pistol in the other, he opened the secret door. "Great God," he muttered as cold sweat formed on his body. "This thing is beyond all reason, yet with mine own eyes I see it. 2 vows have here been kept, for Gaston the butcher swore that even in death he would avenge his slaying, and his was the hand which set yon fleshless monster free. And he—" The host of the cleft skull lay lifeless on the floor of the secret room, his bestial face set in lines of terrible fear, and deep in his broken neck were sunk the bare finger bones of the sorcerer's skeleton.
They cut it down, and where the pitch-black aisles of forest night had hid eternal things, they scaled the sky with towers and marble piles to make a city for their revellings. White and amazing to the lands around, that wondrous wealth of domes and turrets rose, crystal and ivory, sublimely crowned, with pinnacles that bore unmelting snows. And through its halls the pipe and sistrum rang, while wine and riot brought their scarlet stains. Never a voice of elder marvel sang, nor any eye called up the hills and plains. Thus down the years, till on one purple night a drunken minstrel in his careless verse spoke the vile words that should not see the light, and stirred the shadows of an ancient curse. Forests may fall, but not the dusk they shield. So on the spot where that proud city stood, the shuddering dawn no single stone revealed, but fled the blackness of a primal wood.
If one were to take a walk about the countryside a few miles from Holtwhistle, out from Northumberland and past the wall of Hadrian, they might spy in the distance the slumping silhouettes of an old barn and farmhouse. If they were to draw closer, they would find the whole plot quite abandoned and in a sorry state of dilapidation. The usual cheery sounds of cow-bells clanging as their wearers graze happily in a breezy field, or the customary clucking of hens scratching about in the yard, are all eerily absent, and if, for some reason, one were to spend the night there, they might hear an odd, monotonous knocking sound. The reason for this, I hope, will become apparent as I relate the strange tale of the Wilkerson family, whose descendants are even still, at the time of my writing, burdened with the old property. Now, when it was the knocking first began is not entirely clear. Mayhap there is some old grandam who recalls her own grandmother telling the tale as her grandmother had told it, and so backwards down an ever murkier line of generation upon generation of tellers until our sources reached at last, but I doubt we shall ever truly know. What is known, however, so far as the story is to be believed, is that about 60 yards from the front of the Wilkerson house lay a great stone which was old when the bricks of Babel lay unbaked, and the armies of Akkad had yet to sally forth to win old Sargon his dominion. Upon this stone, when night had draped herself about the land, was heard the tireless knocking of a little hammer thumping fruitlessly against it. Those who passed by the spot on their late homeward travels all reported seeing a bent old crone wrapped all in a grey shroud of great antiquity, and crowned in a low black bonnet. Every night was the same. The old woman would sit perched like a nesting hen by the bulk of the stone, and hammer vainly at its side until the first rays of morning bid her shadowy form depart. For this reason, those who knew of her named her Nelly the Knocker. As the years passed, time and familiarity dispelled much of the initial dread the spectre aroused, for she had never harmed anyone, and even the incessant knocking became merely another instrument in the usual chorus of night noises. All this had been so for as long as anyone could remember by the time the Wilkersons settled there, and was so for nearly a decade and a half after. Then it happened that 2 of the Wilkerson boys had come into their own as young men, and one of them, being a shrewd and thoughtful sort, decided old Nelly had been working towards some gain worthy of all those uncounted years of toil. And so he, his father, and brother came to the stone at the height of daylight, when Nelly was nowhere to be found, lest she break from her knocking and command the night itself to swallow them up. They buried a little cask of powder beneath the stone, and set the fuse to burn till rock was sundered, and the venerable vault gave up its hoary treasure. When the clouds of man-made thunder had cleared, a glinting drew their gaze, a metallic twinkle that had long ago been etched deep into the soul of man, and tempted him always to greater and greater feats of courage, foolishness, ingenuity, and madness. Cold as old Pluto, whose darksome realm of death it dwells in, yet shining yellow as Sol and Victor. The prize they claimed that day were 3 closely packed urns filled all to the brim with gold. Now here, as most Wilkersons will tell it, the gold was secreted away successfully, that Nelly knocked no more, and that they all lived happily ever after in their new-found wealth. There are, however, a few hushed murmurings which tell another story. How the knocking never stopped, but merely moved 60 or so yards from its accustomed post to the Wilkersons' house. How the Wilkersons themselves grew more pale and sleep-deprived by the day, and of the subtle queerness which had entered into them and grew more pronounced as the years passed. How once merry and wholesome farm creatures became furtive, unruly beasts, nearly wild as manged wolves and strangely watchful. And all through the night a knocking, now grown hideous with an unfamiliar note of hatred, a repetitive, thumping tattoo which seemed to drive a blackened nail of malice into the very foundations of the house. Now and then a Wilkerson man with too much ale in him might let slip that Mrs. Wilkerson had taken to sitting up all night at the spot in the wall whence the knocking came, and give reply with her own little hammer. Years came and went, and the family seemed to hold out hope that the knocking could be outlasted, and would one day stop. But night after night the sound came as it had always done, and kept up till morning. The children spent most of their treasure in moving away, one purchasing his own farm closer to Brampton, and the other leaving the area entirely, in favor of the stern factories and crowded streets of old London, hoping perhaps the smoke of progress and industry might veil him from the older things that yet linger in the forests near little villages. Each had made offers for their parents to join them, but were always refused. The Wilkinsons came to be seen less and less about town, until finally they stopped going out altogether. One day a rare caller came to the house to check in on them, and found poor Mrs. Wilkinson with a hammer lodged in her skull. Her husband was nowhere to be found, but the door had been left ajar as if in mad flight, and a set of faded footprints ran about 60 yards from the house, near where the great stone once sat, and there ended. Mr. Wilkinson was never found, despite a week of searching. The police surmised that he had murdered his wife and fled, though the older folk wonder. The property has since been left abandoned, and though it has long been for sale and at a price far lower than what it's worth, strange rumour born of stranger night sounds keep it firmly in Wilkinson hands. The road which ran near the farm has fallen into disuse, for though the house is empty and the treasure long spent, Nellie keeps knocking, as she has for as long as any can remember. The steeples are white in the wild moonlight, and the trees have a silver glare. Past the chimneys high see the vampires fly, and the harpies of upper air that flutter and laugh and stare. For the village dead, to the moon outspread, never shone in the sunset's gleam, but grew out of the deep that the dead years keep, where the rivers of madness streamed and the gulfs to a pit of dream. A chill wind weaves through the rows of sheaves in the meadows that shimmer pale, and comes to twine where the headstones shine, and the ghouls of the churchyards wail for harvests that fly and fail. Not a breath of the strange grey gods of change that tore from the past its own can quicken this hour when a spectral power spreads sleep over the cosmic throne and looses the vast unknown. So here again stretch the vale and the plain that moons long forgotten saw, and the dead leap gay in the pallid ray, sprung out of the tomb's black maw to shake all the world with awe. And all that the morn shall greet forlorn, the ugliness and the pest of rows where thick rise the stones and brick, shall some day be with the rest, and brood with the shades unblest. Then wild in the dark let the lemurs bark, and the leprous spires ascend, for new and old alike in the fold of horror and death are penned, for the hounds of time to rend.